So here we are with our third episode of the Bible Masterclass. As always, it is presented by Single Spoon Spirit Ministries and your host is Paul Chubb. So just having a look at what we've seen in the last few episodes, we discussed the concept of canon as authoritative in the Christian life and looked at some of the traditions, Christian traditions and their view of the Bible, and also how the canon came to be. Secondly, we discussed the concept of life setting or Sitz im Leben of the scriptural text. That is, that each and every piece of the Bible comes from a specific community with a history and a surrounding context for it. And we began to explore the idea of the Bible as preaching to an audience rather than a written text. So in other words, every time we pick up a piece of the Bible, it was originally written as a message to a specific audience. And if we begin to understand how that audience was supposed to respond to it, then we begin to understand that text and the message of that text. And this is sometimes called social criticism. So one day. So we have the Bible. It's had a very long history of development, something like 2000 BC to 200 AD, give or take. It's gone through many writers and it's gone through many hands. But I can pretty much assure you that Moses didn't sit down one day and decide to write the Torah. Neither did Isaiah decide to sit down and write the book of Isaiah. Rather, these works arose in response to a specific situation, and they arose over time, so they were responsive rather than someone sitting down to write it. What is more, it is very unlikely that any one person wrote any one bit. The exception, of course, are the epistles, in which case we can probably say that Paul did sit down one day to write Romans. And these are the main exception to this rule. We have the concept of a redactor. So in the beginning was the oral tradition. You think about some of the earliest stories in Genesis. It is very clear that the context of those stories is not the kind of context that would lead to literary endeavour. The amount of people who could read and write at the time of Abraham was incredibly limited, and was settled rather on cities and countries rather than just sprinkled through a population. There was no real reason why people like Abraham needed to write. They were herdsmen, nomads. They didn't need to write. All they needed to do was to be able to move and to feed their animals. So we started off with these early traditions, these early stories, as being an oral tradition. And the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, is a compilation or an edition. So someone put together these oral traditions. And in there are also written traditions that come from a later time. And I believe that these started to be compiled, edited and redacted probably around the time of David. It's fairly clear that up to that point there was no real need for writing. The fact that the Israelites came out of Egypt in the Exodus and through the time of Joshua to come into the Promised Land meant that the last time they had access to writing was actually in Egypt, and we have absolutely no hieroglyphs in the biblical text. So it's probably fair to say that it really started to come together around the time of David. That was the time when they had a court, when they had a need for the ability to write so that they could control society. So we have indications that there were written accounts of different things. And the first one probably comes up in the account of King Josiah, where he was doing this reformation of the cult, and in the middle or the beginning he was tasking the priests with restoring the temple, renovating it, and they found this book. And that book is almost certainly not the complete version of the Torah that we have today, but it was probably a proto-version of Deuteronomy. And if you want to check that out, have a look at 2 Kings 22. There's no real answer to what it actually was. If you want to see some discussion around it, check out that link there. It has a good overview in about a page of the different theories. We have the Bible as a written text surfacing again at the time of Ezra. And Ezra read the book of the law in Nehemiah 8. And most people agree, most scholars agree, that probably what he was reading was from something that was fairly close to what we have today in terms of our Pentateuch. So you have this steady accretion of work, of sources, of text through time to slowly build up the biblical text rather than someone sitting down and writing it. So if we look closely at the Torah, we come to the source theory of the Torah. There are several different versions of this, but this is one that gives you an insight into what the scholars are actually saying about it. Essentially, there are 5 books in the Torah, there are 4 sources, and 5 phases of redaction. The first step is that of the Yahwist. And if you want to check out the Yahwist work, have a look at Genesis chapter 2 and chapter 3, and note the kind of laid-back storytelling style of the Redactor. The word Yahwist, or the term Yahwist, comes from the fact that he uses the Yahweh as the name of God in his text. So Yahweh did this, Yahweh did that, and so on. And back about 100 years ago, you find that Yahweh used to be transliterated. So it's a Hebrew word that had the letters changed to their English equivalent as Jehovah. And so this is called the J source, from the J in Jehovah. And they think that this J source was built up in the Southern Kingdom. So essentially it was the Southern Kingdom's tradition of the Yahweh cult. So the Southern Kingdom was Judah, Jerusalem, and everything south. The Northern Kingdom was Samaria and Israel and everything north. What's more, the J source is considered to be the oldest source. So the second source is that of the Elohist. It comes from the Northern Kingdom, so Samaria and North Israel. And like the Yahwist, he's called the Elohist because the Redactor tends to call God Elohim in the text. And so the source is called the E-source. So these two groups, these two characters were busy putting together the Bible and the Torah in the north and the south, and the Assyrians invaded around 732 BC. and proceeded to take the northern kingdom into exile. Now, if you look closely at the account in Kings and Chronicles, you'll see that not everyone went into exile. Some of them were left there. And in this case, someone managed to escape the northern kingdom's exile and took the east or south to Judah. And over time, these two sources were combined to form JE, which becomes the kernel of the current Torah. So moving forward, we come to the time of Josiah, who was a good southern king. Check him out around 2 Kings 22. And he was busy carrying out a revival or reformation. Now, depending on your text, whether you're going with Chronicles or Kings, this came possibly at the beginning, although close reading of the text would suggest that it doesn't really say that, or about 6 years into a 12-year revival. And part of this was he told the priest to go and take the money that he'd been collecting for the temple and renovate the temple. And part of the big cleanup, they found this book of law. And no one really knows what this book of law was, but the likelihood is that it was Deuteronomy. And this was the time of the Deuteronomic historian, or Deuteronomist, called DTR in the literature. So, to cut a long story short, Deuteronomy became the start of the Deuteronomic history and the end of the Torah, giving us the 5 books that we have today. On an aside, Deuteronomic history runs from Deuteronomy through to Kings. But in terms of the Torah, we get a work that is sometimes called JED, which gives us 3/4 of the Torah. The final stage of redaction was after the Babylonian exile. At this time, as recorded in Ezra and Nehemiah, there was a strong Reformation movement. Essentially, we had another time of revival, and it was important that the people understood the way that they were to do church. And so the final redactor took JED and added material of their own, for example, Genesis 1. If you have a look at Genesis 2 and 3, the story of Adam and Eve, you see that the whole of creation is summed up in that story. And it's a story. It is this like thing that you'd have told around a campfire. So that on the one hand you'd have a continuity of the tradition of who this people were, and on the other hand you would have entertainment around the campfire. It's that kind of story. Then compare it to Genesis 1 and you have a completely different way of looking at the world. This is Bible for the accountants. It's got plenty of numbers and everything happens one thing after another. And at the end, when God has done the biggest thing possible, then he rests. Okay? And you have that hierarchy moving up to the pinnacle of God's creation. And this redactor is considered by some people to have been some form of priest, and so he's called the priestly writer. And so his source is called the P source. And this gives us the common source theory of the Torah, and also the common way to designate it, which is JEDP. So if you go to Google and type in JEDP and hit enter, you'll be provided with more information than you can shake a cat at. So, was a source produced by a single person? Was it really just one person sitting down and gathering this stuff? That is very unlikely. It is more likely that a source was put together over generations. In most cases, a source was the work of a group or a school or a company that held the same tradition. Close look at the Bible finds some of these groups actually in action if you look closely. So J&E were the schools or traditions of the South and North Kingdom, and if they continued until 732, then we can expect they were being under creation and work for what, about 300-400 years, and so it's more than one person's lifetime. So let's look at the Deuteronomic history. The source theory of Deuteronomic history of DH was still heavily discussed when I last looked at it, which was a while back. And there are basically three different source theories. Some suggested that pretty much all of it was created or put together in Josiah's reign, and it was part of the revival or reformation that he led, and that there was no further major redaction of the work. Another suggestion was that there was a single redaction of this work that happened during Josiah's reign, during exile, because it was important for the people in exile to understand how they'd got there, why they'd got there, and how they needed to please God to get back to where they were supposed to be. A third suggestion was that there was a second redaction, and that happened in post-exile, because at that time they needed to know how to actually live in the land and survive in the land while pleasing God. So let's look at Chronicles and Kings. The large part of Chronicles is word for word the same as other passages in the Bible. Large part of it seems to come from Samuel and Kings, mainly Kings. And if you look closely, you'll find it word for word. If you want to have a parallel, have a look at Chronicles in parallel by myself, and you will see that. One source theory for Chronicles is that they redacted an early version of the text. So you had a version of it before it was taken by the Deuteronomic historian, and the chronicler took that and did his magic on it, and out popped Chronicles. Despite the fact that they share much of the same text and similar sources, despite that, the focus is totally different. Deuteronomic historian is focusing on the failures of the Israelite in cult and kingship, pointing out that unless the Israelites have a strong cult, have a strong king who's doing the right thing by God, then they will fail. Pointing out that the only way to achieve, for example, like Josiah and like Hezekiah, they needed a king who was godly. Chronicler, on the other hand, focuses very much on how to do it right. Okay? He has a much more nitty-gritty view of the world. Over and over again, the chronicler picks up on opportunities to demonstrate to the people how to build the temple, how to run worship, how kings are supposed to behave, and so on. So that is what he is focusing on. So let's look at Isaiah. There is an abrupt change from worry to hope in Isaiah 40. Around Isaiah 37 to 40, you have the end of the prophetic material. And it is all doom and gloom apart from a few bright sparks in there. It's all about judgment. There's about 2 or 3 chapters of stuff borrowed from Kings about Hezekiah and his interaction with Isaiah. And then all of a sudden, it's comfort, forgiveness, new starts, new possibilities, glory, God reaching out his hand to Israel, etc. An abrupt change to hope at chapter 40. There's a lesser change around Isaiah 55-56. And that is going from the hope of 40 to 55 through to admonition. You need to do X, Y, Z, otherwise you'll be in trouble, is the kind of message of that portion of Isaiah. So there are 3 competing source theories for Isaiah. Firstly, Isaiah and his disciples in Jerusalem created and compiled the whole of Isaiah. This was during, Isaiah has a very long period of ministry, but Isaiah through to Hezekiah's reign. That time, before exile. And it was all written by Isaiah and his disciples, no doubt sitting at his feet, taking down dictation. There are big problems with that. Remember the principle that every text has an audience. Why would God tell people that the name of the third king down time is such and such? Why would he do that? Like, I could imagine him saying, well, if you don't get your act together, then judgment is coming, and judgment will be nasty. And we see that all the time. But I can't see that kind of detail. So there's got to have been at least one redaction. The second theory is that Isaiah and his disciples created or compiled 1st Isaiah, chapters 1 to 39, and the rest was created or compiled by an exilic author called Deutero-Isaiah, or 2nd Isaiah. And then there's the third option, which is 1st Isaiah, which is Isaiah 1 to 39 by Isaiah of Jerusalem. 2nd Isaiah is Isaiah 40 to 55, and it's exilic. And Trito-Isaiah is 56 and following, which is post-exilic. So, sources tended to be written or compiled by a series of people. And if you look closely, as I said, you will find them. So major prophets tended to gather disciples. Not just major prophets, but also spiritual leaders. So if you look in 1 Samuel, you'll find Samuel surrounded by schools of prophets. Have a look at 19 verses 18 and following. Elisha and Elijah were the head of schools of prophets. Check out 2 Kings 2, where they went on that trip, and everywhere they went, they met schools of prophets. These were their disciples, their followers, who were there to do Elijah and Elisha's bidding, and they were worried about them. Or even consider the Apostle Paul. He collected Titus, Timothy, Demas, and many others. And even later, Luther had Melanchthon. And these people collected, interpreted, and produced the sayings of the great man. They held that tradition and kept it because it was important. Even if you begin to dig into the role of apostle in the New Testament, you will find that they had this role. They were the keepers of the tradition that Jesus gave them. They weren't just there to preach the gospel. They weren't just there to lead churches. They were there as the eyewitnesses of what Jesus did and what he said. They held the tradition. That was what they were there for. So looking at the New Testament, we have the Synoptic source theory, or the Synoptic problem. If you look at Luke and Matthew's Gospel, you'll find that a large part of it is made up of Mark. Because there is none of Luke or Matthew apart from these passages, and for other reasons, it is considered that Mark was probably the first Gospel written. Luke Gospels grew up in Paul's churches, and Matthew's grew up in Hebraic church. So very different Sitz und Leben, very different message, very different style, and things that are important to the communities. So when they came to write their Gospels, Luke and Matthew both grabbed Mark's text and used lots of it to create their Gospels. They also had two other sets of sources. The first one appears to be a list of quotes from Jesus, and both use that source. And this generally is called Q. Finally, both of them have material that is unique to them. It's respectively called Special M for Matthew and Special L for Luke. So having gone through all this, why is it important? It is important to realize that the Bible is a real mishmash of different things. However, they have been brought together to have a holistic message. It is a complex message. If you go to any corporation and ask them to give you a copy of their corporate documents and policies, you will end up with a pile of paper. And you will look through it, and it is a mishmash of different stuff. However, it all has the same purpose and the same message, and it is about the survival and the operation of that company. So that is the way the Bible has a holistic message. So if we look at a single passage and consider it, its Sitz und Leben and its original meaning, then that is one layer of meaning. If we consider that meaning and put it in the context of the other passages round about it, and in the final context of the Bible, we have a canonical context. This understanding that we need to understand the Bible in the terms of the whole. Secondly, when you're scratching your head over why the number of animals is changing in your text, when the writer seems to be schizophrenic as to whether he is in approval or disapproval, when you come across things that you just can't come at, like dashing babies against rocks, the different sources begin to explain why we have that different stuff in there. It is not all there for you to say, okay, here is the Bible. We will follow it. It says dash babies against rocks. Let's go and do it. Where's the nearest nursery? No. That is put there so that you can understand a place where people have come from. Okay? The source series specifically explains those kind of issues and those kind of details. Thirdly, if we believe in the concept of a redactor, then the redactor has a specific message to speak. If we can see how they have put together their different sources, then we can begin to understand what they're actually saying and what the burden is of their interest. And this is called something called redaction criticism. And it's another way of getting an understanding of what the Bible says. So what is the key point and take home? Firstly, differences in text are due to differences in source and differences in different redactors' purposes. This is why Kings and Chronicles is so different. They've got different redactors, although they have the same content. Studying the way the redactor puts the sources together often gives insight into their purpose, and this is called redaction criticism. If you want to understand one of the Synoptic Gospels, one of the best ways to do it is to look at the 3 synoptic passages, the 3 passages that are talking about the same thing in parallel, and start thinking about, well, why did my redactor put it together in that way? What is he actually trying to point out? And finally, only the final level is authoritative, and that is the canonical context. So, as always, there is a copy of these slides up on the website, singlespoon.org.au. Have a look under Biblical and Bible Masterclass. And secondly, you can find additional information, additional homework if you like, biblical studies on this material. Thank you.